Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I wanted, I'm going to start by introducing our panelists and why we're here tonight. And before I do that, I want to start by giving a few thank yous for how we've all gathered here tonight. We want to thank the Peace Alliance Winnipeg, the Manitoba Cuba Solidarity, the Faculty of Arts at the University of Winnipeg, and the Center for Research in Cultural Studies at the University of Winnipeg as well. My name is Arzu Singh. I am faculty at the University of Winnipeg at their Women and Gender Studies Department. I'm really grateful to be here today to have all of these very important voices here tonight, particularly within our location within so-called Canada, to speak to the urgency of our current global and political moment, which has wrought war and genocide and Western sanctioned violence across the world, and the connections and reverberations of the violences of coloniality that are sort of far-reaching, yet at the same time need to be examined within our local contexts. And so, as our program highlighted, we're here to make some global connections. We've everything from like the U.S. bombings of the Caribbean citizens at sea, military interventions in Trinidad, kidnapping of the Venezuelan president, everything to the ongoing genocide in Palestine and the UAE-backed genocide in the Sudan, and the crises in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the blockade fuel in Cuba, and of course, most recently, the US-Israeli bombings of Iran and Lebanon. So yes, this is what we're here to speak about tonight. And before we start, I am just going to give us a little bit of a land acknowledgement of where we're all gathered here today. I just want us to remember that we are located on Treaty 1 territory and the national homeland of the Red River Métis in Winnipeg, Manitoba Abbey. The building around the University of Winnipeg and in this area are part of the Red River settlement, and so the space and the surrounding area's existence depends on the thefts of settler colonialism. These are the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, the Anish-Inubu, the Ininwadak, the Nehu-Towak, the Ochi, the Shanakwawi, the Dakota Ottawa, the Mischief Métis people, and this territory is a place of significance for the Dene Solene and the Inuit, some whom have been living here for generations. We acknowledge that our water is sourced from the Shoal Lake 41st Nations, and Shoal Lake 39 is also impacted in Treaty 3 territory, and that most of our hydroelectricity comes from Treaty 5 territory in northern Manitoba. In recognizing where we gather as the lands of Indigenous tribes, nations, and peoples, we also recognize that their access to the land is to this day severely impacted by the state. Everyone on these lands has the responsibility to uphold these treaty relationships, and each of our responsibilities in these relationships differ according to our unique positionalities and gifts that we can contribute to one another. We also acknowledge that the spirit and intent of these treaties have not been honored by the settler colonial government, who continues to benefit from resource extraction of these lands while simultaneously enacting violence on Indigenous peoples and communities. If our land acknowledgement is to have integrity, we must also acknowledge violences and dispossession elsewhere, especially with Canada's complicity in these settler colonial projects. We acknowledge that the Canadian state's colonial, imperial, and capitalist logics and actions impact not only the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, where we stand today, but Indigenous peoples globally. So Canada is a global mining powerhouse and is complicit in the humanitarian crises in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and the genocide in Palestine. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission reminds us that this truth is a prerequisite for guiding our actions in the spirit of reconciliation. We strive to honor and uphold the TRC's 94 calls to action, as well as the final report from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirited Peoples. 231 calls to justice, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 46 articles. So land acknowledgements must also mean land back and a restoration of Indigenous relations to the land that they have been long caretakers of. And so with that, and I feel like a lot of that conversation will be also taken up today with our speakers, and I'm going to give a brief introduction of our panelists here today. Tamanisha John is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics at York University, works on Caribbean development, sovereignty, politics, as well as Canadian foreign policy, economic imperialism, financial exclusion, and corporate power. She has published in leading peer-reviewed journals such as Class, Race, and Corporate Power, and the Review of Radical Political Economy and Social Economic Studies. Brendan Devlin, over here, is a writer and activist from Winnipeg who specializes in capitalism, Canada, China, and anti-imperialism. Owen Schlock is a writer and columnist from Winnipeg who specializes in Canada and foreign affairs from an anti-imperialist perspective. His books include Canada in Afghanistan, a story of military, diplomatic, political, and media failure from 2003 to 2023, Targeting Libya, how Canada went from building public works to bombing an oil-rich country and creating chaos for its citizens, and Canada and NATO, the myth of a global peacekeeper. And also Carrie Sinanan, who is an associate professor of global pre-1800 literature at the University of Winnipeg. She grew up in Trinidad, Port of Spain, and then the occupied 6 counties of the north of Ireland. She specializes in the Black Atlantic, Caribbean slavery and race, and the global dimensions of Black, Indigenous, and Caribbean resistance and abolition up to the present. So, welcome to all of you, and welcome to our panelists. So I'm going to hand over to our panelists to begin our conversation.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. Can you hear me when I speak like this? Okay, good. I also have to say, because I did not include it in my bio, but I'm also a member of the Black Alliance for Peace, the Caribbean Solidarity Network, and the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. And this is important because I'm going to start off by just sharing a fact with you all, and that is that Canada is an imperialist country. In fact, if I could put my input into the poster title, I wouldn't say Canada is complicit, but Canada is a country that is directly implicated in imperialism, capitalism, and uplifting the U.S. Western-led imperialist system. And I have to say that from the start because I've come to realize that many Canadians have a sanitized understanding or are wholly unaware of Canadian history and of Canada's foreign policy actions abroad, not only historically but in the present. And so many Canadians almost have a visceral reaction when you point out the fact that Canada is an imperialist country and is implicated in the global capitalist and imperialist system. At one point, I even had a Canadian ask me to provide a number or to quantify what many meant when I said many Canadians have a sanitized understanding or unawareness of Canadian history. And on what grounds do they reject the claim that Canada is imperialist? I say that there's 4 shaky grounds. The first is that they say, well, Canada does not possess any colonies, as if Canada itself is not a settler colonial entity. They also say Canada does not go to war with other countries, as if Canada isn't sometimes the first person at the site to allow the US troops to come into the building. They also say Canadian investments abroad are smaller than other Western countries. And of course, this is because people who say this don't care about global South countries or the fact that Canadian investments in the Caribbean have always been much larger than the United States, given its imperial connections with Britain. And they say, well, Canada itself has outsized U.S. foreign investment, so the U.S. somehow owns the Canadian economy, as if foreign investment itself says something about dependency. If that was the case, then the U.S. would be the most dependent country in the world since it receives the most foreign investments globally. And so, now that I sort of briefly debunk those four myths, I can provide more in-depth analysis on them, and I'm hoping that the rest of the panel will also pick up on some of this. But first, one does not need formal colonies or settlement in colonies to engage in colonialism or imperialism. Walter Rodney and others have long pointed out that it is how the colonist or imperialist draws states and peoples into the colonist web of preferred commerce that matters the most. And this is why neocolonialism is an issue in the present amongst various countries throughout the world. That said, Canada is a settler colony that continues to dispossess Indigenous peoples from their lands while violating numerous treaties. Canada's first set of foreign policy with Indigenous peoples banned their cultural redistributive practices like the potlatch to implicate them into Canada's preferred web of international commerce, where they could be effectively exploited to the benefit of what became and now is Canada. Outside of its settler colonial history and present, Canada has also attempted various annexations in the Caribbean, both pre- and post-World War II. And this was due to the high amount of Canadian financial interest in the region. And though annexation failed because of, Canadian racism, they didn't want to inherit a large contingent of Black and Indian people, but also Britain denied Canada its Caribbean colonies. Still, Canada's control over financial systems in the Caribbean region has allowed Canada to choose winners and losers within Caribbean economies, and Canadian financial power in the region privileges and props up tourism as the sort of sector in the Caribbean and of the Caribbean. Second, Canada supports repressive military efforts in the global south through NATO and the US. However, it does not only play a support role, it also plays an active one. We frequently talk about how the Ottawa Initiative, or what would become the 2004 coup in Haiti, was planned in Canada. And that also explains why Canadian troops were first on the ground to secure the airport. Further, in 2019, Canada's then Foreign Minister or Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, stated that the crisis in Venezuela is unfolding in Canada's global backyard. So Canada is often one of the first countries to not recognize legitimate presidents in Latin America, providing a sort of norms and rights language framework for U.S. transgressions against those leaders. This is also in line with the fact that for the past 2 decades, the elections have not been held in Haiti. Canada has played a key role alongside other members of the core group to select illegitimate Haitian presidents. And in that time, we know that Canada and the rest of the core group have directly managed Haiti into mismanagement. This is because both United States and Canadian corporations have an interest in dispossessing Haitians from their land so that they can acquire those lands for mining, pushing those people into Port-au-Prince so that they could work in manufacturing sectors that the US and Canada predominantly uses in North America. And so there's an interest in pushing people into that chaotic situation in Port-au-Prince because they get to take the land and mine on that land. Third, it's simply not true that Canadian investments are always smaller in comparison to other Western states. This is only true if you're looking at Canadian investments in Western states themselves. Canadian investments in the Caribbean outnumber investments from other competing Western states like the US. In fact, US financiers frequently complain that Canada's competitive edge is due to its financiers having to follow less regulatory guidelines when operating abroad in the Caribbean. We also can't downplay the fact that it's, Canadian bankers helped to found the sort of independent Canadian state, and that's why they effectively assert a monopoly today in Canada, where even United States banks can't break the, stranglehold that Canadian banks have within Canada itself. And so U.S. investments in Canada and vice versa is more indicative of a co-constitutive relationship that will look drastically different if one state were in independent status, given its historic lack of development. And so what I'm essentially saying by this is that any time the U.S. is investing in Canada, Canada is able to protect its economy or not, depending on what suits the interests of the Canadian capitalist class, in ways that Caribbean countries can't. They simply can't kick Canada out of their countries. And even when they have approached the Canadian state to regulate their banks in our countries, the Canadian state frequently sides with its own banks. And so this brings us to the fact that as an advanced capitalist state, Canada-US relations are overemphasized in order to minimize Canada's own settler colonialism and imperial expansion, in order to negate Canadian imperialism so Canada can present itself as this neutral actor and thus neutral arbiter on the international stage. So this is why, for instance, it was a Canadian judge that was able to rule on partition in Palestine, even though Canada was squarely in the camp of the US imperialist interests. And so what we have seen is that Canada and the US have a relationship that allows Canadian capital to expand, that allows Canadian resource extractive corporations to not only be the most insidious within Canada, but also globally on the African continent, in Asia, and also in the Caribbean. And as Vladimir Lenin noted in 1916, imperialism extended the life of capitalism by enabling it to expand qualitatively. And settler colonial states like Canada became advanced capitalist states due to violent internal and external expansions. Today, Canada, like other industrialized developed countries, have been preoccupied with questions of international order, which has in turn necessitated an increased focus on global and domestic policing and militarization, and also making the world more amenable to Western capitalism. This is why, even though people are uplifting Mark Carney's speech about the international system being unfair, and he was cool with it until it's turned to Europe as something, amazing to happen, when he's just pointing out the fact that he's fine with this unfair, unjust system as long as it's not applied to Europe and other states like Canada that have a stake in uplifting that same system. The capitalist class in Canada today is empowered by imperialism to the detriment of workers in Canada, who are propagandized to be actively hostile towards immigrants and immigration and workers abroad as part of attempts to misdirect anger from the imperialist contradictions in capitalism to sow disunity. And if we take to be true Lenin's analysis of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, then anti-imperialism struggle and solidarity globally is essential to defeating both capitalism and imperialism. Yesterday, I had a colleague or a friend, Aaron Fernandez, in speaking about why global solidarity today is confused and unable to unite for clear anti-imperialist organization, especially in an era of heightened anti-imperialist aggression, is because settler colonialism in the sort of industrialized countries props up whiteness. And he's not talking about a skin color whiteness or sort of the shallow understanding of whiteness, but whiteness as a sort of state-making project that everyone has to aspire to, wherein we detest and hate revolutions and resistance to white supremacist imperialist capitalism. And so we're told to behave and to be good subjects or citizens in today's lingo. And so everyone is trying to perform a sort of normative language that tells people to behave. And to me today, this showcases in the sort of nuanced conversations, wherein you can have a country being bombed or invaded and its president kidnapped by the US and the Western imperialists, and people are saying, well, we have to be nuanced and talk about rights, as if rights justifies murder, invasion, and the denial of sovereignty. And so if I had to talk about how we can show anti-imperialist solidarities in the present, first we need ideological clarity. We must be reminded that the primary contradiction in today's system is imperialism. Secondary contradictions do not matter unless and to the extent that they support imperialism. So if your country is supporting US aggressions against other countries, then yes, you should be critiquing or condemning your country. If a country is under bombardment by the US, it makes no sense to talk about the situation of women currently in that country, because the women don't have a situation if they're dead. And so we need ideological clarity. Second is that a lot of organizations in North America need to be more principled and disciplined when they organize. Stop allowing people without discipline into your organizations, because they get people disillusioned and disaffected by movements. If someone is being openly hostile to racialized people, trans people, disabled people, queer people, kick them out. They don't do any service but weaken organizing. Stop allowing people without a commitment to learning to take up so much space when they're speaking. If they're not there in your political education meetings and they're not doing the work, don't let them co-opt time, because they add to that confusion that sort of weakens solidarity building. And also, no one in the United States or in Canada are going to pick up guns and revolt against their government. Most of the counter-revolutionaries and reactionaries are the armed people, and they will align with the state. And so we have to think, what is our power here then? And to me, if you're an academic, you have to provide theoretical cover for resistance. Stop engaging in these stupid condemning games because they confuse to the lack of ideological clarity. If you're outside of academia, you have to provide the ideological cover that allows us to support anti-imperialist movements globally. Otherwise, and if you are not doing that, you are just aiding imperialism.
Yeah, that's great. Good timing. Thank you so much. Yeah, there's so much to be said. We'll have a more collective conversation as we move on, but I don't know if anybody wants to go next, but we can go down the line if you'd like. Would you? Oh, next. Yeah, please go ahead.
Sounds good.
The mic?
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Tamanisha. I think that was a really important way to establish a framework for the discussion that will follow. And the first thing I want to state for my contribution is that all the wars and crises described in the description of this panel, from Latin America to Africa to Asia, these are all interrelated in various ways. And foremost among the similarities between these events is the relative decline of US imperialism in the current moment, and efforts by the US and its allies to secure its power across the globe against both state competitors and anti-imperialist and anti-colonial movements of resistance. And of course, the Canadian government is participating alongside the US in these efforts to salvage a waning hegemony in all kinds of ways. And I want to begin by reading from an article in The Nation magazine that was published during the late Biden administration. It was an article that kind of came and went, and I think many people have forgotten about it, but my mind returns to it regularly because I think it provides some instruction for how we should view ongoing US-led and US-aligned atrocities and global crimes, particularly in Palestine, Lebanon, and Iran. And I think this article helps answer the question of where US imperial planners are hoping all of this death and destruction will lead. So in the article, the author, Ada Chavez, lays out the agenda of the, quote, Biden doctrine and what it meant for US global power and the world during the previous US administration. And as I read this, ask yourself if it still sounds relevant. Quote, one goal of the Biden doctrine, as New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman called it, is to achieve the global legitimacy necessary to, quote, take on Iran in a more aggressive manner. With Hamas out of the picture and a demilitarized Palestinian state under the influence of the Gulf regimes, the thinking goes, the US will have Arab cover in the region to be able to counter Iran, and then put all of its energy toward a confrontation with China. So that was Biden's global agenda: take out the Palestinian resistance and allied resistance forces, then destroy Iran, then move on to China, the biggest global challenger to US power. It's an agenda aimed at removing all major state rivals to US hegemony, and it's obviously an agenda that the Trump administration has adopted as well, continuing the genocide in Gaza and the US-Israeli war on regional resistance, and alongside Israel, launching the war on Iran that it seemed Biden had lacked the will or opportunity to launch himself. And accompanying these wars of aggression has been a concerted effort to undermine the authority of the United Nations through the targeting of UN organizations like UNRWA and through Trump's creation of the parallel Board of Peace organization. This continued aggression across Asia has been supplemented under Trump by a reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. Not that it has ever gone away, but it's clearly been supercharged during Trump 2.0. We see this with the tightening of the over 60-year blockade on Cuba, efforts to break regional ties with Cuba, threats against Mexico and Colombia, electoral interference as seen in Argentina and Honduras, and an expanded military presence across South America through alliances with right-wing governments like Noboa in Ecuador and Milei in Argentina. And all of this while the US sows terror in the Caribbean through the regular massacre of civilians on boats. That's not even mentioning the attack on Venezuela, which is likewise inseparable from US global imperial policy. I think it's worth noting that the US attacked Venezuela and effectively seized control of its oil reserves only a few months before Washington launched its joint war on Iran with Israel. This war has largely paralyzed the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of global oil consumption flows. And I think it's very telling that the US launched this war, which has massively disrupted global energy markets, only a few months after making its move to reassert control over Venezuela. I also think it's quite telling that the attacks on Venezuela and Iran have both targeted two energy suppliers that primarily export to China and represent cumulatively about 20% of China's energy imports. At the same time, Africa remains in the sights of imperialism, as evidenced by the war in Sudan, the US bombing of Nigeria, US diplomatic pressuring of South Africa, and the continued bombing of Somalia, the country with the longest coastline in Africa and massive amounts of untapped oil, natural gas, and minerals. What we're seeing today is a US global policy of terrorism and intimidation aimed at beating down the progressive forces in Latin America, the Caribbean, West Asia, and Africa through wars, sanctions, and the repressive actions of comprador elites in these countries. So surveying all this death and destruction, the question naturally arises, where is Canada in all of this? And the unfortunate answer is that Canada is participating in this worldwide campaign of violence and destabilization. Canadian support is material and military as well as diplomatic. It's very active in certain areas. It's more hands-off or passive in other areas. But all in all, Canada, through its support for illegal wars and sanctions and genocide, is deliberately contributing to the erosion of international law and global institutions and creating massive dispossession, displacement, and death. Canadian sensor technology is assisting the US boat massacres in the Caribbean. These sensors, manufactured in Ontario, are used by the US military to track and surveil the civilian boats that they bomb. And when Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand was asked about these blatantly illegal massacres, she absurdly stated that it's up to the US government to determine if its attacks violate international law, as though the US government itself is the sole authority on what constitutes a war crime. Canadian soldiers remain embedded with the US military in West Asia, even as the US wages its murderous and illegal war on Iran. Carney has not ruled out sending Canadian troops to directly aid the US and Israeli war of aggression and to forcibly reopen the Strait of Hormuz. On top of this, Globe and Mail reported last week that the US warplanes that are bombing Iran are using Canadian airspace to refuel for these bombing missions. And under the conditions of NORAD, the US doesn't even have to ask Canada's permission to do this, but I think we all know Canada would give the permission anyway if anyone asked. Anita Anand, several days ago, announced that Canada is imposing additional sanctions on not the US or Israel for starting an illegal war and bombing schools and universities and all kinds of civilian infrastructure, but more sanctions on Iran. This is how Canadian foreign policy works. The country that suffers an illegal, murderous aggression gets sanctioned, while the aggressor that bombs schools and hospitals as policy and invades other countries to take their resources and says it openly, that country receives Canada's assistance. For years, Canada sanctioned Venezuela. Canada helped form and lead the anti-Venezuela Lima group. While thousands of Venezuelans died from the unilateral US sanctions, 40,000 Venezuelans by 2019, according to the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Former Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland said, quote, "We are discussing with our partners ways that sanctions can be expanded in order to have even more bite." Earlier this year, the Carney government supported the illegal operation to kidnap President Maduro and Celia Flores, which occurred in the context of outright colonial US assertions of ownership over Venezuelan land and resources, which Carney did not criticize. The Liberal government has also made no criticism of the illegal fuel blockade of Cuba and has refused to send oil to Cuba to alleviate the people's suffering. Canadian drones are fueling violence in Haiti, a country in which Canada has an extremely sordid interventionist history, as Tamanisha mentioned, including deep involvement in the 2004 coup against Jean-Bertrand Aristide. In Sudan, Canadian weapons exports are fueling genocidal violence committed by the UAE-backed Rapid Support Forces. And at the same time, Canadian weapons continue to flow to the Israeli military through the US, despite the supposed existence of an arms embargo. And the Canadian government is well aware that Canadian arms continue to fuel the genocide They know this because the Carney government recently voted down Bill C-233, the No More Loopholes Act, which aimed to stop the uninterrupted flow of Canadian weapons into the US-Israeli death machine. So this means that the government made the conscious decision to continue supporting illegal and aggressive US-Israeli wars in West Asia, which have killed untold thousands over the past few years and displaced 6 million people since 2023 across Palestine, Lebanon, and Iran. Simultaneously to all of this, the Canadian government is increasing military spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. That's the goal. And recently they met the 2% GDP guideline. Meanwhile, I just read an article yesterday in CTV News that food banks across Canada are being forced to reduce services because they simply don't have the resources to keep up with the growing food insecurity in this country. So while an increasing number of people in Canada are going hungry, our ruling class seems to have an endless supply of money and resources to support US imperialism and its front organization, NATO. What this means, in effect, is that Carney is redirecting an enormous amount of social wealth out of public health, education, and infrastructure toward a socially and ecologically destructive policy of militarization. The US has encouraged this, of course, but the Canadian ruling class also clearly feels that this military buildup serves their own interest as well, given how tightly those interests are entwined with the US and Atlantic imperialist ruling classes. And it's important that people understand NATO is not defensive, and it never has been. It's an aggressive US-led military alliance that has destroyed countries across the world, including in Southern Europe, Northern Africa, and Asia, and it has inflamed tensions in sensitive areas like Eastern Europe and East Asia. And it is actively aiding the illegal war on Iran, as NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has boasted in just about every interview he's given over the past few weeks. And it's transparently run by the US. NATO members have to adopt US-made weapons systems. Nixon said in the 70s that the US was in charge of NATO. Just today, Marco Rubio gave an interview to Al Jazeera where he said that without the US, there would be no NATO at all. So this should be crystal clear. And it should be crystal clear that Canada is actively supporting US plans to subjugate West Asia to tyrannical US-Israeli domination, to beat Latin America and the Caribbean into submission through bombs and blockades, and to continue fueling war in Africa for profit and hegemony. And it must be said, none of this appalling behavior is new. When Eve Engler and I co-wrote the book, Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy, we were able to document Canadian support for 22 coups around the world since 1953, including Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in Guatemala, Lumumba in Congo, Juan Bosch in the Dominican Republic, João Goulart in Brazil, Sukarno in Indonesia, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Milton Obote in Uganda, Salvador Allende in Chile, Aristide in Haiti, Zelaya in Honduras, Lugo in Paraguay, Yanukovych in Ukraine, Morales in Bolivia, Castillo in Peru, and of course, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. And in documenting these coups, one thing becomes clear, and that's that in most of the cases we delved into, Canadian support for the overthrow of government was followed by massive Canadian capital investment in those countries. Because the overthrown governments were almost always left-wing or socialist-oriented, they had nationalized key industries, and the coups that brought down these governments reopened those sectors to transnational capital. Canadian military campaigns have long been driven by similar motivations, as seen in Iraq, a war in which Canada did participate despite Jean Chrétien's claims, Afghanistan, and Libya. So the larger point I'm making is that nothing the Canadian government is doing today is new or surprising. Things like Canadian support for war on Venezuela or Iran, Canadian complicity in wars in Haiti and Sudan and elsewhere, and Canadian refusal to act against the illegal blockade on Cuba, these things fit perfectly within the logic of Canadian foreign policy that has prevailed for years and years and years in countries like Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, in regions across Africa, countries across Africa and regions like Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia. This is a logic of profit over people. It's a colonialist and anti-communist logic that naturally opposes the emergence of progressive state formations and popular movements. And it's a Western chauvinist logic that truly imbues its supporters with the conviction that they are allowed to dictate to the rest of the world what kinds of governments they are allowed to have.
I
just gonna give it a little time warning.
Okay, I'll wrap up.
You're good.
The last thing I want to touch on is solidarity work, which is always important, but I think is becoming even more critical every year, every month. And as Canada's government fuels global militarization, we have to be aware that these policies will, and in fact are, having an impact on how we organize and how we show solidarity. One, because increased militarization will lead to more economic precarity, and it already is. But also, this militarization and spread of imperialist violence will have a direct effect on how we challenge such horrendous policies. And we already saw a recent attempt to criminalize protest in Winnipeg with the Evan Duncan's anti-protest bylaw. This hit in a very close to home fashion. And it shows that as imperialist violence grows, so does resistance to imperialism domestically. And the state is aware of that. And that's the reason why such measures are imposed. So we should all be vigilant and prepared to confront these measures in the near future. And that's where I'll end.
Thank you. You prefer to go next? Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Owen and Tamanisha. These are great, rich discussion already. So I want to try to provide some more historical context to contextualize Canada's response to the kind of world crisis that we're seeing right now. We're gathering today in a context of decline of U.S. imperialism. The increasing violence and destructiveness of U.S. imperialism the world over should be read as an act of desperation. The U.S. cannot confront China, Russia, Iran, or any other counterpowers by itself, so it is turning toward hostile, coercive diplomacy to compel its allies to increase military spending to stand a chance. Yet the hostile turn is now threatening a revival of inter-imperialist rivalry that is putting the survival of inter-imperialist alliances like NATO at existential risk. Canada's international position, though, depends on these same imperialist structures and alliances. And so Canada has an interest in trying to maintain inter-imperialist unity. So it shouldn't be a surprise, then, that Canada has embraced the demand that NATO powers spend vastly more on defense and enlist in what amounts to a drive to world-threatening war. So many have been surprised by Carney's embrace of Trump's foreign policy, but if we look at it from the historical perspective of how Canada has related to inter-imperialist rivalry, it becomes a lot easier to understand. So, because Canada was born in the context of an inter-imperialist rivalry between the British Empire and the United States. Canadian capitalism developed in a context of inter-imperialist rivalry in North America, which essentially saw these two powers competing for Canada. And this was the international context then for Canada's brutal process of northward and westward settler colonial expansion at the expense of Indigenous nations following Confederation. Now, there's a prominent economic historian who once called this genocidal process defensive expansionism. This is a fundamentally apologetic framing that naturalizes Canada's claims to land from the prairies to the Pacific coast to the vast north, which it did not control and could not legitimately claim. It's defensive only from the point of view of empire. There was nothing preordained or natural about Canada acquiring the Northwest. At the same time, though, there was nothing natural or preordained that Canada's expansion would stop there. Precisely as Canada was expanding west, in the very beginnings of Canada, already there was interest in Canada's ruling class in acquiring British colonies in the Caribbean. This was seen as a measure that would diversify Canada's economy, and it would enhance Canada's independence on the world stage while also safeguarding British influence in the hemisphere. So while this annexation did not come to pass, Canadian capital established a growing presence in the region during these early years, and this presence expanded further following U.S. imperialism's defeat of Spanish colonialism following the Spanish-American War, which saw the U.S. effectively take control of many a former Spanish colony, not least Cuba, in the following decades. So Canadian corporate expansion into the region meant that Canadian ruling class interests, even at this time, were served by American military supremacy across the Western Hemisphere, and we should consider this when we're assessing the effective support for American militarization of the Caribbean today. So this history underscores that from an early period, although Canada was part of the British Empire, which was locked into this inter-imperialist rivalry with the United States, it didn't have the same interest in pure rivalry. It had interest in cooperating with U.S. imperialism where it could. So I'm going to jump us forward a little bit to 1914, when the intensification of inter-imperialist rivalry plunged Europe into the First World War, and the Russian Revolution of 1917 that emerged out of this war changed the international equation. Not only was it the first successful socialist revolution, it was a frontal challenge to imperialism's grip over the world. The Russian revolutionaries rescinded the Russian Empire's claims to its colonies, and they called on the colonies to rise up against the capitalist imperialist powers subjugating them. This was the birth of a truly anti-imperialist counter-systemic power, and its example had reverberations across the colonies. At this point, then, the imperative of inter-imperialist unity became existential for imperialism, became very important. So with that, I'm going to jump us forward again to the end of the Second World War. Following the Second World War was nothing less than a worldwide anti-colonial revolution. National liberation movements in the colonies were poised to win their liberation from European colonies that were mortally wounded by 2 world wars. At the same time, the Soviet Union had emerged severely damaged but triumphant after playing the leading role alongside China in defeating fascism, and it stood ready to support the anti-colonial liberation movements across Asia and Africa. This new international context meant that imperialism was in many respects on the back foot, and inter-imperialist unity under US leadership and on an anti-Soviet basis became imperative. During these post-war decades, Canada would step into a role as an inter-imperialist unifier, working hard to stave off the destructive possibilities of inter-imperialist rivalry and to broker a unity that did not come naturally to the imperialist powers, even when they were united in alliances. So Canada's support for the creation of Israel, for example, required brokering inter-imperialist unity between the UK and the US around the question of the partition of Palestine, where there was some discord. Canada supported partition, and the future Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson worked to convince the UK and the US to set aside these differences, underscoring the importance of Israel as an outpost of Western influence in the region. Canada was among the earliest promoters of a transatlantic military alliance to fortify the capitalist West from the Soviet Union, and Canada was one of the founding members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949. Canada's foreign policy ambitions would increasingly depend on the sort of inter-imperialist unity that NATO could facilitate. But Canada's role as an inter-imperialist unifier really takes clearest form with the Suez Crisis of 1956. When newly liberated Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal, taking over this narrow waterway cleaving Africa and West Asia from the British and French interests that had previously controlled it, Britain and France colluded with Israel to attack Egypt. Israel launched the military attack. Britain and France intervened, saying they were protecting the canal from possible damage from the war. But their attempt to reassert colonial control of the Suez Canal was not only rejected by the vast majority of the world, it was also rejected by the United States. The United States was not interested in a return to colonial empires, which actually restricted US capital's access to vast markets across the world. They were not interested in returning to this kind of formal spheres of influence that blocked off their international expansion. So what this meant, though, was that there's a tense dispute between the US and the UK, which could ultimately threaten the survival of NATO, which by this point was less than 10 years old. So Canada's Lester B. Pearson famously proposed a UN peacekeeping force to resolve the dispute and allow the UK and France to save face while caving to international pressure to exit. Although Suez is typically associated as like the origins of Canada's great peacekeeping history, it was ultimately it was pursuing unity within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And Canada would continue to play this role through the end of the Cold War. Now, after the end of the Cold War, which was ostensibly a fight against socialism, but after the defeat of the Soviet Union and the fall of the socialist bloc, imperialist intervention intensified. It did not wind down. The post-Cold War period saw the imperialist bloc, now thoroughly unified under US leadership, emboldened to pursue far more brazen and destructive imperialist campaigns. It turned on Saddam Hussein, formerly an ally in his war against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and subjected the Iraqi people to new levels of immiseration in the First Gulf War and with its accompanying sanctions. NATO intervention was the nail in the coffin of Yugoslavia, which was a founding member of the non-aligned movement and the last remaining socialist state in Europe. But despite this triumphalism, new challenges emerged in this period. No sooner than 1992, only a year after the victory of the West in the Cold War, were US planning documents identifying China and Russia as near-peer competitors that posed potential threats to US dominance. So in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba was left vulnerable as the collapse of the Soviet Union meant the collapse of its most valuable trading partners, which acted as a lifeline against the US blockade. Naturally, the US intensified the blockade in a deliberate and familiar attempt to weaken the Cuban state by starving the Cuban people of basic life necessities. Now, not only did the Cuban people defy the odds and survive as a sovereign socialist project, but it was joined by a new wave of progressive and socialist governments across Latin America, most importantly, Venezuela. So in this context, though, the imperialist offensive required a kind of recalibration among imperialist powers under US leadership, and Canada stepped up to the plate to play an increasingly aggressive and important role in this imperialist offensive. Canada made decisively important ideological contributions to the practice of humanitarian intervention, that is, military aggression rationalized on supposedly humanitarian grounds. In particular, Canada led the development of the responsibility to protect doctrine, which reframed sovereignty not as a right of people realized through a state, but as a set of obligations by a state to uphold and abide by a particular conception of human rights. Were a state unwilling or incapable to protect the human rights of its population, the international community, in practice this means the imperialist countries, had the right and obligation to intervene to protect people from their own state, irrespective of sovereignty. So this doctrine was first put into practice in NATO's Kosovo War, which was, again, the nail in the coffin of Yugoslavia. It was also put into practice in the 2004 coup d'etat in Haiti, before it was approved at the UN. This was the official rationalization that Canada offered for its active leading role in overthrowing a popular, democratically elected president that was engaging in a process of redistributing Haiti's wealth to its working majority. Canada would successfully lobby the UN General Assembly to adopt and legitimize the responsibility to protect doctrine in 2005, and this doctrine would most consequentially be applied to NATO's destruction of Libya in a military operation led by a Canadian, no less. So the Libya, exploiting the pretense of a UN Security Council resolution, working from the responsibility to protect doctrine, NATO waged a war against the Libyan state and destroyed what was once the most prosperous country in Africa. Civil war and the reemergence of slave markets have followed in the wake of US bombs, and Libya, like Haiti, has not recovered from imperialism's so-called protection. So while imperialism's ability to lay waste to humanity and the planet are not in dispute, this should not be mistaken with its ability to actually achieve its goals. The imperialist alliances went on this global rampage of humanitarian interventions and the global war on terror, which aimed to reshape West Asia along lines favorable to Israel and imperialism. But new counterpowers were taking note and pursuing alternatives. These alternatives can most clearly be seen in the sovereign development projects like the People's Republic of China, like the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, both of which at times have found massive success in delivering massive improvements in living conditions to their working majority, not to mention the popular empowerment that flows from that. Now in West Asia, where the main impediment to improving living conditions and empowering working classes is US and Israeli military aggression and destabilization, Iran has endured as a bulwark of anti-imperialism and has underwritten an axis of resistance to Zionism and imperialism through its support to the Palestinian resistance, to Hezbollah, to Ansar Allah in Yemen, to resistance movements in Iraq, and to the Syrian Arab Republic up until its collapse in 2024. This is the reason it is targeted. This is the reason Canada cut off relations with Iran in 2012. This is the reason why Canada designated the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization in 2021. This is the reason Canada slanders Iran's support for resistance movements as sponsoring terrorism, and this is why Canada condemns Iranian self-defense as aggression and applied further sanctions to the aggressed upon country just last week. Iran is currently standing as a last line of defense against the Greater Israel Project. But the US-Israeli war has not gone according to plan, and it is not moving favorably to the US. This was a desperate attempt to cut off Iran's support to resistance to Israel and stands as only the latest sign of US decline and its increasingly dangerous desperation. Now Trump finds himself asking his imperialist allies that he spent the last year antagonizing to join him in a suicide mission to forcibly open up the Strait of Hormuz. While some arrangements are being made behind the scenes, his imperialist allies are not lining up to support on his terms. So indeed, this turn toward this hostile America First diplomacy is sowing divisions in the ranks of imperialist alliances, further undermining US imperialism's ability to successfully project power across the world. Mark Carney recognizes the threat that this divisiveness poses to imperialism's collective power over the world, and he has devoted himself to promoting unity within the US-led imperialist alliances, which has entailed some measured criticism of the current main source of discord, being current US leadership. So this is then a renewal of Canada's role as an inter-imperialist rivalry at a time when, this is a renewal of Canada's role as an inter-imperialist unifier at a time when inter-imperialist rivalry is threatening a comeback.
I'm just going to give a little time warning.
Okay. I will close with just reflecting on what the failure in Asia has severe implications for this hemisphere. And the inability to confront China and Russia and impose its will in Asia has led to a renewed focus on protecting its primacy in the Western Hemisphere and its natural resources, which has meant heightened aggression toward left-wing movements and governments in the hemisphere, most especially Cuba and Venezuela. So Canada has at least tacitly embraced the U.S. militarization of the Caribbean during the second Trump term because it amounts to an intensification of decades of imperialist policy in the region, rather than any kind of reversal. It is aimed at the overthrow of Venezuela's socialist government and undermining the regional sovereign development initiatives that it has championed with Cuba. For example, Venezuela's Petrocaribe program, where the Bolivarian Republic provided subsidized oil to Caribbean partner countries, had to be suspended under duress of U.S. sanctions. We are also witnessing U.S. momentum in coercing Caribbean countries to isolate Cuba by rejecting doctors sent to their countries despite deficits in healthcare capacity. And of course, in 2026, the U.S. attacked Venezuela, kidnapped its president, who remains in New York. As I've been emphasizing here, though, this brazenness should not be mistaken for achievement. The U.S. has had to settle for a decapitation strike because the right wing that it supports does not have the legitimacy to govern Venezuela, so they can't just do an outright regime change operation. The Bolivarian government remains in power in Venezuela, albeit governing with a knife to its throat. Cuba is currently in negotiations with the U.S. under similar duress. Not only has the blockade intensified and the oil embargo reduced Cuba to the worst conditions since the revolution, these negotiations are inevitably being framed by the escalating U.S. aggression in the form of bombing and murdering civilians in Caribbean waters. So I'll just implore everyone here to remain vigilant and remember that the Bolivarian Revolution, where the Bolivarian Revolution and the Cuban revolutions go from here, remains an open question. They have overcome adversity before, and they are navigating some of the most challenging circumstances yet. We have a role to play in their resistance as people residing in the aggressor countries, and this moment calls not for cynicism, but for renewed commitment to solidarity with these revolutionary projects that have contributed so much to humanity's collective liberation. Thank you.
Karen, please.
Okay, let's see. Well, I knew my co-panelists would be coming with some hard-hitting facts, so I'm going to take a slightly different approach to the opening here, and I wanted to begin with a story. I grew up in Port of Spain in Trinidad, close to the savannah, which is in the downtown area. It was an area still populated with very old trees, enormous salmon trees, lush vegetation. I moved back to my mother's home in County Down, Northern Ireland, and I've been recently tracing some of the connections between County Down and Winnipeg, mainly via Lord Dufferin of Clandyboy. The Clandyboy estate is really where I grew up. I grew up between Trinidad and Ireland. And of course, Lord Dufferin became Governor General of Canada in 1872, which is all to say that the same people who colonised my Irish family came here to Winnipeg. I would return to Trinidad every summer, and one day when I was there in my teens, some of us went down the islands, which is the expression for taking a day trip to the Bocas Islands, like Gaspar Grande and Chagacari in the northwest. They just lie between Venezuela and Trinidad, and you can see Venezuela, which is only less than 20 miles away from the coast of Trinidad at that point. It was a beautiful calm day on this day and bright blue sky. Suddenly we were surrounded by a host of yellow butterflies. They were so delicate against the dark blue sea, and they often fly at that time in the rainy season, migrating between the continent and the island. I tell this story because in the maelstrom of the terrifying escalating global crises that we've all been describing, that one can barely respond to or absorb, and especially 2026 has just been an escalating ramp of terrifying disasters. In this context, it's really vital to remember what we are fighting for and what we can no longer take for granted. I moved here to Treaty 1 territory in 2023, and I'm being taught in new ways from Anishinaabe, Cree and Métis friends and mentors that it is from the land we learn. And the land has to encompass air, water, skyways, our relatives that are part of creation, and even the small yellow butterflies that we need, otherwise we can't exist ourselves. So a Cree elder, Sharon Pelletier, told me recently that she believes newcomers like me are brought here to Turtle Island, and especially to this part of the Forks where the rivers meet. She says we're brought here to remember why we are here and what we know from before. And so I think that's what I'm committed to doing. This has taught me that solidarity has to be cross-temporal as well as trans-geographical. What do we all have to remember is a question I would ask us to think about. How are we connected originally at our sources? And what does this mean for what we are today calling anti-imperial solidarity? Because I think the thing that connects us is that empire worked to separate us, right? To give us all our special bad names because of our innate resistance to death. The hovering label of terrorism or terrorist hovers over the words anti-imperialist, and that's very, very deliberate. And it makes simple care for earth, life and each other seem extremist, and that's again very deliberate, and that's what we have to resist. This is an imperial West founded on genocides that have never stopped. At the same time, as everybody has described so well here, empire never stops connecting. It's always connecting and knows that it's got its own web to mind. But it discursively isolates events, nations and peoples, while its corporations, sanctions, bombs, surveillance, biological warfare, concentration camps are an interconnected web of anti-life domination. I was in the borderlands in Texas before I came here to teach in Treaty 1 territory, and the same prisoners are in the borderlands, in Dili concentration camp, the same prisoners in the prisons in Turtle Island, the same prisoners in Palestine that are tomorrow facing the death penalty that's just been passed by the Knesset. So the world where butterflies and also eagles and other things can migrate freely is the world that is at stake if we don't do something. Aimé Césaire, the Martinician anti-colonial writer and activist, describes colonialism in this way. I am talking about natural economies, and everybody here's described really the disruption of these natural economies. That's really what empire does. There were harmonious and viable economies adapted to indigenous populations, food crops that are destroyed, malnutrition permanently introduced, and we're going to get that right here in Manitoba. We're already getting it. Agricultural development oriented solely for the benefit of the metropolitan countries. The raw looting of material. That's what empire is. It is an economic force of mass extraction. So decolonial thought and praxis are always going to be in opposition for this. The Land Back Yellowhead Institute Red Paper states that while biodiversity is declining in all parts of the world, it is declining much less rapidly in those lands still managed by indigenous communities. So it's really important to connect and understand anti-imperial and anti-colonial solidarity, I think, as a positive commitment to indigenous lives and systems that predate the settler state and are our only hope for addressing the extreme risks we're all facing. We have learned this week via CBC's Brett Forrester, who's a member of the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point First Nation in southern Ontario. He reported that Canada has had an extensive programme via which RCMP infiltrated Indigenous groups in the 1970s, including the Manitoba Métis Federation, under, quote, their native extremism policy. So that tells us everything about who is extreme, just people protecting Indigenous lives. This tells us clearly that any organising that seeks to protect the land or people is extreme under Western imperialism. So one thing, as we've all said, is that we have to remember Canada is still committing genocide here today. It never stopped. Winnipeg is the city with the highest proportion of Indigenous people, yet at least 1/3 of those live in poverty. This segregation, apartheid in the city is visible today, and it connects me back to Belfast and the huge inequities that still persist under British occupation. This is deliberate. Water justice has again become urgent as 4,000 people were evacuated in January from the Pimichikamak Cree Nation as a result of the Manitoba hydro outage, leading to frozen and burst water contamination. We should connect this to the US-Israeli targeting on water and desalination plants in Palestine and Iran, so they're deliberately targeting Iran's water supply right now. Empire always targets life. Even during Manitoba's deep winter, the underground fires are not still extinguished, and we might face contaminated air for everybody. Last summer, over 7,000 people were evacuated from their homes, and many of them have not been able to return because of mould in their houses now. So these major disasters that are a part of the ongoing genocide of Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and part of what Brendan described as the expansionist project of Canada, we must consciously connect this to our conversations about Sudan and the DRC that are too marked by Canadian corporate greed and state power. Canada does not care about clean air or water here or abroad. The same forces that are stealing from public money under Mark Carney to increase military spending are the same forces taking from First Nations their basic rights to water, land, shelter and air on their own land. Now, Mark Carney, I have to take responsibility as also an East Indian Trinidadian, sadly, for the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, who's Kamala Persad Bissessar. So she and Mark Carney both won their elections a year ago, and they've been disastrous but also very important for the kind of intra-imperialist power that Brendan described. Both have offered their full solidarity to the US in exchange for being mocked, used and threatened with invasion, but that's political theatre, and I hope more people can understand this. Canada is not only not under threat from the US, this is entirely the wrong framing. It is the same entity, essentially. Gerald Horne, the historian, calls it the spawn of England, both entities. British and French settler colonialism both invented the states. Canada and US resolutions and independence are celebrated as freedom, while Indigenous sovereignty from here to Iran is labelled as terroristic. Oil, of course, is a huge factor in the complicity of both Trinidad and Canada with the US. Trinidad has long supplied the US eastern seaboard with gas. This is not sustainable. And there's a really good book by Ryan Cecil Jacobs called The Petro-State Masquerade, which names exactly how Trinidad and Tobago's oil and gas industries were used by the post-colonial state to fashion a model of governance during the 1970s and the oil booms, but this is in fact imperiled by declining fossil fuel production and a loss of state control, and that's part of the loop that Trinidad's in at the moment, that it does not have the dominance that it used to, and these are exhausting resources. The TNT dollar was long pegged to the US petrodollar, and there will soon be grave effects from this economic fiction built in unsustainability and fear of the US. Oil and gas are also core to Canada-US relations. The Canada-US oil trade relation is the largest bilateral energy trade relationship in the world, but it is far from a relationship of equals. Canada has been the largest source of US crude imports for more than 2 decades. So Trinidad and Canada have in relation that they've both established racial capitalist models that require Indigenous peoples' dispossessions, and both are antithetical to the nationalised models of the Bolivarian Revolution that Venezuela established, which returned oil revenues to public ownership, and that's really the dynamic everywhere you see. This is why Maduro and Celia are in solitary confinement in New York City under a Muslim mayor. And both Canada and Trinidad are systematically also rolling out AI data centres and projects that nobody asked for, and which in both places will steal our precious remaining water and air from people. Hundreds of acres of farmland near Ile de Chêne in Manitoba are marked for the site of a large-scale data centre which would shift land from producing food at a time when food precarity is increasing to being fully extracted for techno-fascist profit. AI-driven drones are core to current empire. Canada's National Research Council is pouring over $900 million into a long-term plan to establish a drone research facility. We are told this is for Canadian security, as Joly put it. These commitments are part of their support for Western US empire. Canada is also lending its airspace to the US illegal war in Iran, and as Owen mentioned, B-2 bombers are refuelling above us. Mark Gagnon of Moose Factory 15 years ago on the 21st of March, Mark voted unanimously to endorse the bombing of Libya. In 2025, Canada donated surveillance drones to the Haitian Nationalist Police. This is how it's framed. It's a donation to establish security. In the last year, 1,800 Haitians have been killed by drones. Global Affairs Canada told CBC News in a statement, quote, the Financial Times reported that Canada and Norway are both positioning right now to benefit from the Iran war oil price surge. None of this money will be returned to indigenous services that have been deliberately depleted for military spending. So I want us to connect also Iran's socialism to the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century, okay, the 1806 Haitian Revolution, which defeated Napoleon's army and overthrew colonial slavery and established the first free black republic in the world. It was always Haiti that first abolished slavery. Claudia Jones was a Trinidadian journalist who established the West Indian Gazette. She was a black feminist, black nationalist, and a communist. She led several movements, including the US African American Liberation and pro-communism women's rights. And she wrote back then, CARICOM is what we get when the state is taken over by non-revolutionary, neo-colonial national bourgeoisie. This is the 50s. CARICOM acts like little more than a tool of imperialism, and that's what we still have. In 1956, she wrote, American capital has penetrated West Indian agriculture through the Royal Bank of Canada and the Canadian Bank of Commerce, which have branches in all the big West Indian islands. American capital exercises its influence on the economic affairs of British colonies. So Claudia Jones then knew exactly what the patterns was.
Karen, just a little time warning.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up now. So I do want to bring back the memory before I wrap up of Trinidad's past, which was not always in service of bootlicking empire. We did resist, and this is what we have to remember, we have to do so again. Once we refuse the racist segregation that divides us, Trinidad has a sort of 50-50 East Indian, Afro-Caribbean population. Like the current Prime Minister, Kamala Bissessar, I'm also East Indian Trinidad. My great-grandparents were plantation workers under post-slavery indentureship. And after the sugar declined, oil was discovered in Trinidad around 1857. And by 1900, major oil fields were being drilled. This led to the Trinidadian Working Men's Association, which was a transracial group of radical labour organising against the sort of neo-colonial capture of these profits. Trinidadian Marxist George Padmore outlined, quote, these workers and peasants in the West Indies must build up a real revolutionary trade union movement. And in 1937, oil and sugar workers went on a general strike organised by the Oil Workers Trade Union. This showed such promise and fed in then in the 1970s to the Black Power movement in the Caribbean, which again was transracial. Oil workers, the New Dual movement of Morris Bishop in Grenada, the Socialist Revolution in Cuba, Venezuela, Haiti. These are the real revolutions that are fighting for life, and these are similar to the ones in Palestine, the Iran Revolution of 1979, and let us never forget Louis Riel and his Manitoba Métis-led provisional government. We have to connect these things. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists for, there's a lot of connections and overlap and points of discussion. I'm going to open it up to you guys first to see if you have anything you want to respond to each other and some of the things you guys were saying.
I do. I guess I just wanted to add some more context about the Caribbean just based on everything that everyone has said. So in 2004, Venezuela had launched the ALBA program that people sort of refer to as PetroCaribe because they only think about the oil component. But ALBA TCP was a wide range of programs that helped many states in the Caribbean. And it came to drastically include Caribbean countries because Venezuela and Cuba had that trade relationship. And Cuba said, I will not leave my Caribbean brothers and sisters behind because they also suffer the same high energy prices as we do. So the Caribbean was included into that because of Cuba. And so yes, energy was one component. Another component was the medical program. Another component was language schools. And to join that program, Caribbean countries had to recognize that it was an anti-imperialist program presenting an alternative within the hemisphere to US hegemony. And I think that's very important because it branded itself as a socialist solidarity program. And when people just mention PetroCaribe to talk about the oil, they forget that no, it's a part of ALBA TCP, and it was explicitly a socialist series of programs that branded itself as anti-imperialist, going against US hegemony. And this had a tremendous impact in the region. Prior to the launch of ALBA TCP, most people who would migrate out of the Caribbean would either go to North America or to Europe. But after ALBA TCP, because it provided so much opportunities in the region, Caribbean intra-regional migrations drastically increased. So now when people in the Caribbean are migrating, more of them are migrating to other Caribbean countries versus coming to Europe or North America. And I think that that's very important. Why? Because ALBA TCP laid the foundation for programs in the Caribbean that wanted an alternative that wasn't US hegemony, which is why so many Caribbean countries readily signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative by China, which posed a threat to the United States, because they talked about China's influence. But what China did was its Belt and Road Initiative program sort of modeled the infrastructural developments and the instead of Spanish language free programs in the Caribbean, they were offering Mandarin. So there's some Caribbean countries you could go to and take free Mandarin classes, just as you could go to and take free language classes. But that sort of solidaristic partnership was already built in and encouraged with ALBA TCP that China Belt and Road Initiative countries easily signed up for because that infrastructure was built. And I think it's very important to say that. Also, anytime the US intervenes in the Caribbean, whether it's in Haiti, Trinidad, or elsewhere, it makes a particular point to undermine national political institutions and to undermine regional organizations. And so it's not just that Kamala is, dogging out CARICOM and dogging out Caribbean countries in favor of the US, but she is intentionally trying to undermine regional institutions, as has always happened with US intervention. And it's important to note that Kamala, she was elected because, one, less than 30% of Trinidadians voted, but two, Cambridge Analytica was heavily involved in promoting her election. Barbados just had their elections in February, and the reason that they called early election in Barbados was because Mia Mottley was concerned that Cambridge Analytica was already operating in the country and they were sowing too much misinformation. And so when we talk about the rise of the right or conservative regimes in the Caribbean, including in Guyana, where the no confidence vote also triggered early elections, a lot of that was because of US election interference, and we have to be very clear that the US electorally intervened in the Caribbean to bring about right-wing governments that would be in opposition to ALBA TCP and also to the Belt and Road Initiative. The second thing that I want to mention is that Nicolas Maduro is not the first leader in Latin America and the Caribbean to illegally be kidnapped and held outside of the region or outside of his country. The first was actually Louis Vuitton from Haiti. He was held in prison in France because France tricked him into a meeting in Haiti and they kidnapped him from that meeting. And so that is why he died in France in prison. And I think that this is very important to understand because we have a history of undermining revolutionary or those trying to pose alternatives to imperialist domination. Even when Canada wanted to and did coup Haiti in 2004, this was after Aristide said, okay, he will be on board with installing IMF structural adjustment packages and he won't disband the Haitian National Police. Canada wanted to intervene and coup him out because he proposed to raise the minimum wage by, I think it was 20 cents or 24 cents. And so when we're talking about exploitation, we are talking about they care if they're able to exploit by even a penny more. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's very important for people to understand.
Sorry. I don't know if anybody has a response or wants to add.
I had another point, unless somebody wants to respond to that.
Maybe I might quickly.
Go
If I
ahead.
can just say something on ALBA, and I think what the ALBA TCP can help us think about here is just like I think that one of the reasons I think that we're here to talk about like what solidarity looks like in this moment, and I do think it means adopting in part an internationalist view to our national movements, like to our movements in Canada, for a few reasons. Those in Latin America, which are much more advanced than what we have in Canada, take the international question seriously. And you'll notice that every time there's a right-wing coup against a left-wing government in Latin America, as Tamanisha said, they will withdraw from, like they might outright withdraw from ALBA, or they will like not they will end partnerships with Russia, with China, with Iran. And so the right wing understands these international connections and understands the importance of the international question to their national projects. And so the left wing needs to match that. And that being the case, I'd like us to consider that like the ALBA was a regional initiative by Cuba and Venezuela, but it did have international observer members as well, including the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so that I raise that just to say that like this, it's really hard to overstate the stakes of the war taking place in West Asia right now. Iran was a source of cooperation with Venezuela. It was a source of cooperation with Cuba. This is an existential question that will not only reshape West Asia for generations to come, but it's going to change the balance of forces. It's going to change the terrain of struggle in every country and every region around the world. And those who are paying attention to that will be in a position to respond to it.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something, I think it was in Brendan's presentation. He touched on this post-1945 moment of decolonization across Africa and Asia. And I wanted to talk about Canadian foreign policy in that moment because Canada, you know, its Cold War foreign policy attempted to brand itself as understanding of the colonized world and like a friendlier Western power compared to Britain or France or the US. But in fact, Canada, through the NATO mutual aid program, sent weapons to the European empires that were fighting the liberation movements across Africa and Asia. As millions of dollars of Canadian weaponry went to the European attempts to crush the liberation movements. Canada was also, during this period, very friendly with apartheid South Africa. And you can see this just by looking at Canada's votes at the UN in the 60s and 70s, where they consistently opposed sanctions on apartheid South Africa. You could also look at Canada's support for Portugal, which at this time, Frelimo in Mozambique, MPLA in Angola, and PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, the Portuguese colonies in Africa, were fighting for their freedom. Canada was very opposed to this. Canada always followed Portugal's line that the resistance movements needed to be non-violent, that they could not be allowed to oppose the violence that was being done to them with violence of their own. And at the same time, Canada was very opposed to Pan-Africanism, to the spread of African socialism. In Ghana, Canadian soldiers in Ghana trained the soldiers that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah. And the Canadian High Commissioner in Ghana at the time was on record as celebrating this. He said it was a great success of Canadian foreign policy, the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah. And Lumumba, of course, Canada had a big role in the overthrow and murder of Patrice Lumumba. In fact, it was a Canadian UN soldier named Jean Berthiaume who gave up Lumumba to the men who would torture and murder him. And going into the 70s, going into the 80s, Canada was very implicated in the spread of neocolonialism across the continent through support for structural adjustment programs. In fact, there was one instance where Canada, the Canadian government, threatened to withhold food aid to Tanzania if Tanzania did not implement IMF structural adjustment programs, which decimated the country. And you know, for a project that I'm working on, I've been interviewing Canadian anti-apartheid activists who were active in the 70s, especially, meeting with them, hearing the tactics that they used to oppose apartheid and specifically to identify Canadian complicity in apartheid. And the funny thing is, they all knew that they were under surveillance. All these anti-apartheid activists in Canada, they said, yeah, we knew RCMP was tapping our phones. We knew that they had a record of who we were meeting with. They were all under surveillance. And this connects to, I think Carrie mentioned these new revelations about quote-unquote native extremism that the RCMP was surveilling. This was at the same time. In the 1970s. So during this period, the RCMP, they were surveilling indigenous liberation movements, they were surveilling anti-apartheid activists, the women's movement, the left, the Communist Party. So it just goes to show who the Canadian state views its enemies as.
It actually just makes me think of I think it's Schoten's work that talks about the term terrorism as it's the imperial way. It's the imperial name for indigenous remainders, right? That it's indigenous remainders that refuse conquest, and that it's only used against those who fit within its scope, not the state itself. Which is really, really, it's like kind of an interesting thing that's kind of come up throughout all of your talks. Just really quick, any questions from the audience that anybody wants to ask? There's a couple over here, right here in the pink shirt. Yes.
Tamanisha, you talked about people outside the academy providing ideological cover, and I was wondering if you could maybe define that a bit. I think I do it, but I don't know. So I'd be curious to hear you define providing ideological cover outside the academic world.
So it's providing ideological support. So that means not buying into the sort of liberal human rights framing that justifies imperialism, not lending that, not letting that take up too much oxygen, essentially.
Okay, I feel much better now.
Yes, it's a quite easy, low cost task.
Yeah, can I just feed into, and I think I agree with that, and I think I'd take it even further, which is that as a newcomer to Canada, the sort of, a lot of the politics here explain this culture of sort of silence, where Canada's operating under this plausible deniability, even while doing these extraordinary things. And I think that leads to a sort of culture of not naming things because it seems too dangerous or just too impolite even. And I think that's the clarity, is that, what I'm trying to say with, the butterflies and the earth is that we have to be very clear what we're defending here and not let it be mislabeled as terrorism, as extremism, and to refuse, so that if we're talking about Palestine, for example, that we don't allow ourselves to be confused about the right to resist, that we don't allow ourselves to be confused about the lies of settler states' rights. I think the Z word hasn't come up, but Zionism is a huge part of what helped Canada to shut things down after the Second World War. Zionism is a huge part of what inaugurated the backlash and the counter-revolution that was possible across multiple African countries, across multiple Caribbean countries. And it's part of the fabric here in Manitoba and across Canada. And I think so it's being not being scared to name those dynamics as concrete, because think of what Canada itself has to lose if we start to accurately name the inequities and the violences of settler colonialism as a project. And Fayez Sayegh wrote the book Zionist Colonialism, and he wrote that saying in the 60s, everybody else was getting their post-independence nations. That's exactly when Palestine, in 1948, when Palestine goes in the opposite direction. And so we can see Palestine as a hub where the narrative for continuing the expansionist project is established.
Yep. And I also think that part of sort of not giving like these human rights liberal stuff oxygen to support imperialism also includes combating the narratives that allow Canada to have plausible deniability. So ever since I've come to Canada, people always say, oh, Canada doesn't spend a lot on its military. Canada had this good vote not to send weapons to Israel. And I always tell people, in Canada, y'all have 900 private security corporations. I'm someone who studies corporate power, and I was like, Canada doesn't need to spend a lot on its military because it has 900 security corporations that get subsidized by Canadian taxpayer money, and they don't even know it. So oftentimes when a Canadian drone is used to kill someone in Haiti, the Canadian government says, oh, we didn't know and we didn't send it. But they can say that because what they did was you have these private security corporations in Canada making the drones. They tag on that Made in Canada sign, just as they did to the tanks that they let ICE use in Minnesota. And the Canadian government transports these private corporations' manufactured weapons to the countries that they sell them to.
You're not
And so
saying the
technically,
Business Development Bank of Canada is financing imperialism, are you?
but that's exactly how it is. Even sort of when you think about people shocked that Canada cooperates with ICE. Canada cooperated with COINTELPRO to make sure that there wouldn't be a Black Power movement in Canada. So when Black Power activists fled the US, or when they thought that some Black youth were getting too much leadership, they would actively allow COINTELPRO from the US to come into Canada to encourage these Black young people who were between the ages of 14 and 17 to do a crime so that they would go to jail for 12 years so that, Black Power activity in Canada would be calmed. And I think that, people say like, oh, Canada didn't do this. Yes, Canada did, right?
I think there was another hand up back there, please.
Oh yeah, I've got a question and perhaps a comment if I'm allowed to present a comment. And I just find it so interesting because I'm actually from St. Kitts and Nevis, all the old places. Imagine yourself, CARICON took place there 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So I was packed to the TV watching that stuff. And anyway, and I was one in the Dominican, Haiti, imagine yourself, all the chaos going on there between Haitians and Dominicans and everything else. So what a combination, Anglo-English, right? There we go. But yeah, I just had a question, and the question is like, obviously I know these things and we are aware of what's going on, but is there a ray of hope? You see what I mean? Because when I look back home, Trinidad and St. Kitts and all those places, all you see chaos, and when you look at what's happening internationally, you say, well, where do I kind of, see something positive? That's one question. And the other comment is, and you mentioned it already in terms of Zionism and stuff like that, and I've written extensively in relationship to the eschatological aspect of that situation, right? Because evangelicals have a lot invested in the whole thing that someone else is coming from, where. And of course, allowing all the things to happen because it got to happen so that he could come back. And that continued to be spread across the planet, and people are just sedated because it's supposed to happen. So it's prophecy. It's not prophecy. But so that's just a comment. But do you see any way around any ray of hope in terms of all these things subsiding, or group of nations coming up with alternatives? Because again, what was happening back home with Hugo Chavez, etc. I met him actually in St. Kitts in the Wedding Hotel there. All that faded away. I know that for sure. So I'm actually here, right? So I couldn't go to Cuba because a lot of stuff changed. So do you see anything really being forged somewhere that will counteract all this imperialism?
I guess I'm always going to be the first one to talk. But what gives me hope is the fact that Iran is putting up a resistance, and that some people are no longer buying the U.S. narrative. I think that it's a good thing that Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz, and that is something that we should support, as well as them saying, no, you have to trade with us using the Chinese yuan. Part of the reason that the U.S. is allowed to engage in so much bullying, or part of the reason why Western imperialism is so strong, is because so many countries that engage in trade are trading in U.S. dollars, effectively providing a subsidy for the U.S. to be an imperialist actor that leads this Western imperialist system. Something else that's positive is that the U.S. has not been able to achieve total regime change in any of the countries that has just been mass murdering people, and from Venezuela all the way to Iran. Why is that? Because they fundamentally don't understand what socialist projects mean, especially ones that have existed for so long. And so they've told us, oh, the opposition in Venezuela won the elections by 67%, but they're also unpopular, so we can't install them. Because the second issue that they aren't telling people is that democracies in socialist countries don't look like democracies in Western liberal democracies, where people pretend that they elect someone that's representing them. In socialist countries, democracies are more direct. And so the reason why the US was not able to do a full regime change in Venezuela is because the communes in Venezuela, where people engage in direct democracy, they had guns, and they said, well, you can come and try to change our political system in full, and we're going to fight back even if our military didn't, right? And I think that that's very important, because now they can hold the gun to the, still in place government's head. And I always tell people, you will know where the sort of future of the Bolivarian revolution goes depending on how strong the communes remain while the gun is still to the US head. The US had the same strategy for Iran. Maybe if we kill the Ayatollah, the whole government will fall. But no, they're underestimating the fact that these are deep projects. And what is their fascist tendency? They tend to bomb. Most people in the Caribbean, I think, understands that if the U.S. tried to do a ground invasion in Cuba, Cubans would defend themselves. What we're worried about is the fact that they will just bomb people into oblivion. You know, they're cowards, they're desperate, and they're fascist. If that is the case, then they obviously have superior air power. The question then becomes, are we providing the cover for the U.S. to just go and bomb Cubans and kill them for democracy? Because the fact of the matter is, if you held elections in Cuba today, they're not going to elect someone like Marco Rubio. So how are you going to force people to do that? If you had elections in Venezuela today, they're not going to elect Machado or Juan Guaido, no matter how much lies they've told you. So how are you going to do that? And I think that that's very important, because you had some people who tell me, oh, the elections in Venezuela were rigged. And I'm like, okay, so the International Lawyers Association, anything that they said and the other observers said is not credible, but the Carter Center or Foundation for Freedom is. Okay, right? And I think we have to be honest about that.
Yeah, I think I'll just say very quickly that on the question of what can we take, from where can we take hope, I think we can take hope from the fact that there will always be resistance. As capitalism produces its own gravediggers, imperialism produces resistance to imperialism. And yeah, Cuba is still standing. The Venezuelan communes are still standing. Iran is still standing. The Palestinian resistance is still standing after everything that they've been through. I mean, the resolve is just, it's impossible for me to understand that level of resolve and resilience. And I take inspiration from it every single day. And these projects of resistance are still standing, and there will be more in the future. There absolutely will be. I don't think we know exactly where it will come from. We don't know the exact character of these movements of resistance, but they will emerge.
Yeah, and I think the responsibility is, you know, as a sort of person from the global south, remember the global majority, that you know, especially somewhere like Canada, is in a bit of a bubble, you know, in terms of not having the internationalism that's been described as a norm, or perhaps being in a comfort zone of overestimating the whiteness project, which has been tremendously powerful and successful. But there are way, way, way more of us, and that's what solidarity requires, is to move into solidarity with the global south, with the global majority, with the dispossessed, to move into solidarity with what Frantz Fanon calls the wretched of the earth. Because if we don't do it now, we will all be there very soon. And that might sound negative, but it's actually a positive. And I think that's why I'm emphasising that, you know, what's been happening here in Turtle Island for Indigenous people, that's where our solidarity should really start.
That's great.
Yeah.
What time do we have the room till? 7:30? We're okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said about the question of hope, and I would just add that hope for me is a practice. Like, revolutionary optimism is something that needs to be maintained. There's scholar Larashi, he has referred to it as like psychic militancy. It's something that it's an active process of being able to see what is hopeful. I think, like, resisting the urge to fall into despair. I think, like, especially, you know, like with the genocide in Gaza, it's been, like, helpful for me to ground myself. And like, if the people of Gaza have not fallen into cynicism, then what right do we have in the imperial core to do that? And I think, but it's not, you know, I don't want to leave it with just saying there's, you know, we just have to, no matter what happens, we just have to remain hopeful. It's not quite that, but there always are sources of hope. And so, I mean, the Venezuelan communes are materially the fact, that is the reason there has not been regime change in Venezuela. That's absolutely true. I even think a case like Bolivia, where the left was defeated recently, is a case, you know, that was quite disheartening despite the problems with the MAS project in the later years. But only a year, like less than a year after the right took power again in Bolivia, the Bolivian working class mounted a general strike and forced the right-wing government to make major concessions on the laws they were trying to pass. And so, like, the Bolivian left is down but not out. And I think that's what happens in a lot of these countries that have resistance cultures that are stronger than Canada's. And I would just say as well, like, we should not lose sight of the scale of transformation in the People's Republic of China. You look at China in 1947 was one of the poorest countries in the world. In 1978 was one of the poorest countries in the world. It has been a completely, to me, very difficult to comprehend the level of transformation in the living conditions of the 1.5 billion people in China. It's more than the continent of Africa, or the continent of Latin America, sorry. The combined, more than the combined population of the entire population of Latin America and the Caribbean have worked themselves out of extreme poverty in China in the space of a few decades, in the space of a generation, right? And that's a testament to what the collective power of labor in China under a socialist and sovereign government.
Right. Well, I just want to, I think it's a really good note to sort of end on. I want to thank our panelists for being here today, for sharing their thoughts with us.